So, hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. My name's Laura Gordon. I'm one of the regular panellists, but today John Potter, our host, has allowed me to take over the podcast again. I am joined by Councillor Lisa Smart, who is another of our regular panellists, who is a councillor in Stockport and our candidate in Hazel Grove. Hello, Lisa.
Hello, Laura.
And we are also joined for the first time by Councillor Helen Belcher, who is a local councillor stood in Chippenham, which is a former Liberal Democrat held seat in the 2017 and 2019 elections. Welcome, Helen.
Hello, Laura.
And this episode, we will be talking about an issue that has been in the press quite a lot recently, and which some of us might have had come up on doorsteps a few times during the local elections. Others may not have done. I think Lisa and I spoke about this and had quite different experiences. And that's some of the issues around trans rights, trans conversion therapy, and some of the other issues that trans people face in the UK today. So thank you very much for joining us. Lisa, do you want to kick us off by talking us through sort of why this is kind of particularly in the news at the moment?
Thanks, Laura. I think there have been three things really that altogether have probably left a number of Lib Dem members wanting to find out more information. And so we're hoping that the next, however long we have this conversation, will be useful and informative. I think one of the pieces of news that cut through was Jamie Wallace, a Conservative MP who came out as trans recently, and he's the first MP to do so. And that was particularly noteworthy because of, I think, some of the reaction he got both from his colleagues from the Conservative Party and elsewhere, some of the real support he got for that, and some of the just confusion from some other people as well. Another piece of news that's broken through has been about the government doing a bit of the hokey cokey in terms of banning conversion therapy. I think I was probably being quite kind there, calling it the hokey cokey, talking about banning conversion therapy for all LGBT plus people originally, and then stepping back from that and excluding trans people from that ban. And that was something that we as Liberal Democrats had campaigned for a long time, on the belief that conversion therapy is cruel to people and is just harmful, and is saying that there's something wrong with the person who's going through it that needs to be fixed. And we don't agree with that. And so as Liberal Democrats, it's been our fairly long-standing policy to ban all sorts of conversion therapy. So the government doing, let's keep with the okey cokey on that, has been in the news and has really upset quite a lot of people that they're trying to exclude trans people from this. And then the third thing has been some in the media really questioning lots of politicians around issues of, well, what is a woman? Can you define a woman? Should women be allowed to go to the toilet here, there, or wherever? And some politicians have answered that very well, very competently, and other politicians have really got a bit stuck on it and have found it a really difficult question to answer. And that's made an awful lot of people watching them on the TV just really confused about, well, why can't you answer this? And is there something I need to be thinking about more than I am? So it's those three issues, I think, that have broken through in a way that more people than historically will be thinking about some of these issues. Issues have always been, well, transphobia have always existed, right? But lots of people won't have spent as much time thinking about it as they will have done in recent weeks, months, years.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think one of the really interesting things in this is, and I think you've touched on that at the end there, Lisa, is kind of where this has come from and kind of why this has come to a head now in particular. And I don't know, Helen, you've been kind of covering this and sort of thinking about this obviously for a lot longer than certainly I have, but many of our listeners will have been. So, I mean, can you sort of talk us through a little bit of the background and kind of where this has kind of emerged from and why it's come to a head now?
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw some of the signs of it emerging back in 2016, 2017, when the government decided to look at the issues facing trans people. There have always been a group of people opposed to trans inclusion, people who think trans is a mental illness and therefore needs sorting out. And for whatever reason, they managed to gain a whole bunch of traction during 2017, 2018, when Theresa May's government was looking to reform the Gender Recognition Act. Now, what seems to have underpinned it is actually a coalition between various evangelical Christian groups in America, and they've done a very well-funded campaign, which has then found a very unlikely ally into fairly radical feminists. And so what's disconcerted everybody is that we were expecting the opposition to gender recognition reform to come from the evangelical churches, like same-sex marriage. It was the same sort of campaign tactic. And then suddenly we had it coming from the opposite end, the far left, and nobody quite knew what to do with it. And the press kind of picked that up and amplified that. And I think, I mean, I was part of this, I suppose. Trans people were just becoming a bit more confident in dealing with the media. And so that also raised hackles, and people just felt, actually, no, we need to be put back in our place. So there has been a long media campaign now going on for the best part of 4 years, which tries to play on a lot of the simple sounding questions like Lisa has just been outlining, and not really giving trans people a chance to defend ourselves. How many trans people have you actually seen in the mainstream media over the last year or two? Hardly any. So it's an odd kind of debate when you only hear from one side, and that side is busy moaning at the other side for silencing and cancelling them. So we're dealing in 2020's UK politics here. This is not rational stuff. So I think that's the framework that I would put this in. And in the States, you're now seeing a similar, very, very rushed campaign, which is part of the whole culture wars aspect of stuff which is going on. And effectively, I think it's a group of people who, in the same way as the opposition to same-sex marriage and LGBT rights in general going back, they have a vision of the world of how they think it is, and therefore want to impose that vision on other people and require other people to fit into the roles that they have defined for them, which to me is fundamentally anti-liberal. You know, as liberals, we believe in the individual. You've got that brilliant phrase at the beginning of our constitution: nobody should be enslaved by conformity. Boom, that is it. We don't accept the rigid boxes that other people want to put us into. We respect people's individuality. Whereas what we're seeing is the anti-trans campaign, which is actually an anti-LGBT and anti-women's rights, all of these kind of progressive causes. We're seeing that campaign now in full throttle, particularly in the United States, but it's had long legs here as well.
Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Pray to Reigns. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Pray to Reigns have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Pray to Reigns are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Pray to Reigns website at praytoreigns.co.uk/liberal-democrats.
I think there's a couple of things that you sort of said there that I'd like to sort of talk about further. And I think the first one is this, the way that sort of trans rights has been weaponized in the US as a culture war issue. And the government sort of very clearly trying to do the same thing here. And I think what I find really striking about this is how, in fact, it's, if you look at sort of opinion polling on this issue, the sort of government culture war position is not particularly in line with where the public is. And I think if you sort of look at look at sort of opinion polling, you see that actually the public as a whole, and interestingly, women in particular are sort of more likely to be supportive of, things like using the correct pronouns for people, thinking that using the wrong names for people is incredibly rude and you shouldn't do it, that people should be allowed to pee, when they need to pee, and all of these things, which, it is quite reassuring, I think, if you've been kind of sitting in this kind of online space where these issues are kind of, there's a lot of shouting, a lot of heat, not very much light. And then you kind of step back and look at the opinion polling. People's views are pretty consistent on that. So I think that's kind of the first issue that I think is really interesting. This kind of, it's almost like it's a cultural issue, but it's very much imposed from above rather than kind of building on something that's necessarily kind of coming up from below. So I don't know, Lisa, do you have any kind of sort of views on the debate and that kind of link between, the kind of public views and the kind of media environment about it? Because I know when we spoke about this previously, you said it hadn't come up for you at all and doorsteps and things, whereas for me, it's sort of not very often, but it has kind of occasionally come up on doorsteps for me.
So not that it hasn't come up at all, but it's come up very, very infrequently. One, by somebody asking just questions and not getting it, and I think because I was a familiar face thinking, Lisa might know the answer to why they keep having this very odd conversation on Sunday politics or whatever it is, but no, it hasn't come up very much for me. I think your point about the public just kind of being busy leading their lives and wanting other people to be happy to get on leading their own lives as themselves is absolutely right, and it being imposed from above as well. I remember it was Boris Johnson who we should mention in terms of culture war, stokers, was asked a question about the conversion therapy ban, and instantly pivoted onto who can go to the loo where, what about prisons, and that wasn't the question that he was being asked at all, but he clearly wanted broadcast media to have a clip of him talking about these issues because he clearly wanted that to be in the news that day. And whoever is the Prime Minister of our country should know better than that. And that was I thought, a window into, there are many windows into that person's psyche, but I thought that was a useful window and a reminder to those of us who are liberals in terms of how we see the world. Defeating him and his team cannot come quickly enough. I think that was a useful reminder for me.
Yes, I think that's a very fair comment, and that's something that we would all like to see. I think the psyche of Boris Johnson is somewhere where we have all had cause to spend far too much time over the last few years, and the point at which I never have to think of him again will be a happy day, and I think that's something where we can all agree. So one of the other things I'd like to maybe talk about a little bit further, and I mean, Helen, I think maybe if you were able to kind of dig into it a little bit more, is this kind of links between this kind of radical feminist movement, or so-called radical feminist movement, and this debate. Because I think one of the things that I find very, very frustrating about this, kind of whenever it's talked about, is this idea of, if you stand up for trans people, if you stand up for trans rights, if you stand up for the liberal position, you're then accused of silencing women, which sort of, I am not quite sure where, usually men telling me, a woman, that I am talking wrong and that I'm silencing women. I'm not sure how that came to be seen as the feminist perspective, but somehow we seem to be in this place. And this, I think I'm also a little bit concerned about sort of some of the narrative around it, and especially around sort of sexual assault and sort of safety and sort of all of this. I mean, do you have any thoughts on kind of where this has come from and why this is happening in the UK specifically?
There have been reports and research which has sort of highlighted meetings in America in 2014 or 2017, which has generated a campaign plan, which we are now seeing being outworked. I mean, they have managed to get by playing on the whole freedom of speech angle, they've managed to get a lot of the press on board, or certainly the editors on board. And a lot of what they're doing is trying to manipulate freedom of speech arguments into this into this particular sphere. I do take heart. Laura, you talked about the opinion polling. Actually, as a campaign to shift public opinion, it's been pretty unsuccessful. Public opinion has marginally moved against trans people, but not a lot. And there's still a majority of people who I think as Lisa was
saying, the kind of general public view seems to be confusion about why this is on the TV, or confusion about why politicians are prevaricating, rather than a kind of strong view that they're getting the answer right or wrong. Which I think you're right, that is encouraging. And I think that they've hit on this tactic of asking what seem to be very simple questions, like what is a woman?
But actually, the moment you go beyond year 8 biology, you start to realise that those questions do not have simple answers. And it's rather like saying, well, what is love, or what is the colour blue? Whilst the colour blue may have a particular definition in physics, in wavelengths of light between particular frequencies, somebody had to make a decision where those frequencies were, because it blurs into purple one end and green the other. So there's always some debate about the fuzziness of boundaries. There's been an introduction of a term of biological sex. And what that actually means when they use it is an assumption around somebody's chromosomes. And it is an assumption because there has been research which shows that for some trans people, there seems to be a biological component to their identity. So is that not biological? And then the whole argument, they ignore things which are inconvenient to them, like the existence of intersex people, or actually the existence of trans men, because what they're trying to do is to make people afraid of trans women. This very simplistic idea that because the vast majority, huge percentage of sexual crimes are committed by men, if you then have this simplistic ideology which says that if you're born one way, that is the way you are forever. Therefore, a trans woman was born as a man and therefore still has all those violent tendencies. And therefore, even if they transition, nothing's going to change this innate rapist nature that we supposedly have. And all that's trying to do is to play on women's fears. And for some women who have been sexually assaulted and raped, that those fears are very easily triggered, and that argument resonates. And so you suddenly have a whole group of people who are repeating these messages, which are actually kind of playing on or reinforcing their trauma. But the statistics show that there aren't that many statistics. The problem is in this sphere, and that they tend to be distorted quite a lot. But the few statistics that there are show that trans women are actually much more likely to be violent recipients of violence than committers of violence. But the very, very few examples of trans women committing assaults then are inflated across the media to again reinforce this impression that other women should be afraid of trans women, when actually the opposite is the case, that trans women should be afraid of other women. And all women, have to have a level of caution. We all learn a level of caution around some men because of the way that they behave.
I think that's such an important point. And if I'm honest, this is one of the things that I always find so concerning about this. And I think you touched on it when you were speaking earlier about the way it is kind of explicitly anti-feminist a lot of the time in the arguments that are being made. I mean, if you kind of look back at the kind of feminist movement in the kind of 80s, 90s, 70s, going back even further, it was all about, well, no, actually, being a rapist is not inherently, an inherently male trait. Most men are not rapists. And if a man is a rapist, that is a choice. And that is something that, is not, that the law needs to be, punishing and so on. And, it was one of these kind of key arguments that it's not sort of up to women to protect ourselves from this inherently violent trait. It's all about, it's all about choices that are being made and kind of emphasizing those choices. And it kind of, it almost like once you start saying, oh yes, but even kind of, you're obviously everything you said is absolutely right, but I just think you can go even further. And as soon as you start saying, oh well, yes, but this is an inherent risk, then you're almost like explicitly letting kind of sex offenders off the hook. But I do think there's a sort of much broader point as well about kind of women's safety and the way we kind of treat sexual assault in our society, and especially around kind of policing, reporting to the police, and these kind of broader range of issues, and the fact that sort of a lot of women sort of do feel afraid moving around in the world a lot of the time. And I don't know, Lisa, I think, do you sort of have any thoughts about how we can kind of be addressing this in the kind of campaign, and I suppose given that this is a podcast for campaigners, sort of are there campaigns that we can be running that would sort of focus on kind of the actual issues that affect women's safety, and trying to kind of get to a point where women do feel a bit safer going through the world?
I think applauding those campaigns that are run by different police forces who target rapists, so saying the way you stop rape is by stopping raping people, rather than, walk home with your keys in your hand, don't go home, don't get drunk, don't wear a short skirt. They are not effective anti-rape campaigns, because all the evidence suggests that you need to reduce the number of rapists, not the number of people walking home after having 2 shandies on a night out. So applauding the good behaviour and calling out the bad behaviour is, I think, how you do it. And I think some of it as well is about what we're hoping to do with this discussion today is to help clear up some questions that people might have. And they might go on the internet, say, oh, I've heard somebody talking about this, or I've been in an odd corner of the internet and found people talking about these issues, and I'm just a bit confused now. I want to understand it better. So I think people looking at useful resources as well. So there are some really helpful corners of the internet where you can have lots of questions answered, rather than just sparking more questions and more questions about, well, of course I want women to be safe. What does that mean? Does that mean prisons should be organised differently from the way they are? How big an issue are some of these things that people are talking about a lot? So it's finding the good fact-based areas of the internet that can help answer people's questions. The other point I wanted to make was about some of the parallels that we're hearing, both in the language that's being used and also the approaches from previous campaigns against the LGBT community. So earlier phases of this, maybe in the 1980s, and talking about people, and I'm thinking particularly talking about gay people as though they are inherent predators, and using similar language. And that point you were making, Laura, about choice, as in some of those inherent traits, rather than, no, to be a rapist, somebody chooses to be a rapist, that's. And I just think some of the language that's being used and some of the tactics that's being used have many reflections back into some of the campaigns that we saw in previous decades.
I'll pitch in also, because what we're finding is that a lot of the arguments, even when they're rebuffed, remain remarkably sticky. So Lisa, you mentioned prisons just now. Actually, when trans people are put in prison, there is an assessment of risk. So a trans woman does not have an automatic right to go into a women's prison. They are assessed on the risk that they would pose to other prisoners, but also the risk that they would be at from other prisoners. So there's a kind of two-way assessment which goes on. And part of the reason for that is around, again, the risk of violence. And prisons are graded in terms of severity of risk to the public. So the very highest security prisons are all actually men's prisons. So if you're a very dangerous woman, assessed to be a very dangerous woman, whether you're trans or not, you will still be put in that men's prison in a secure unit, but still put there. So that's that argument, which has been repeated again and again and again, even by government ministers in Westminster debates, simply gets brushed off and ignored as inconvenient truth. And so the arguments remain remarkably sticky in this area, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, and I think that does touch on this. I think what you've kind of just mentioned, this kind of assessment and the fact that sort of often it's there are genuinely complex issues being raised that I don't think anyone is sort of trying to deny or obscure, and where there is a kind of genuine balance of different issues, different people's safety, different people's rights that have to be considered in making what will almost always be a sort of very difficult case by case decision. So I think kind of one of the things that is quite useful to know is the kind of framework within which those decisions are made. And I think my understanding is that is sort of largely governed by the Equality Act. Is that the case, Helen? Is that something you can talk us through a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, the Equality Act was passed in 2010 as one of the last things the Labour government did. And it pulled together all the disparate forms of anti-discrimination legislation which were in effect at the time and tried to place them on a more common footing. And it introduced two other aspects, one of which was discrimination by perception. So you could be discriminated if you were perceived to have a particular characteristic, regardless of whether you did or not. And the second one was the idea of indirect discrimination. So you could have a policy which adversely affects particular people because of religious belief or because of sex or whatever. And so that was then made a common base. And we need to understand that the Equality Act started from a basis of you must not discriminate. Discrimination is bad. That's the basis of the Equality Act. It sets a baseline.
We can agree with that, can't we? We're all on board.
I know, yeah, you'd have thought so. And it sets a baseline. It's not a target to reach. It's a baseline from which everything else builds up. Now, because you need single-sex spaces where women can feel safe, then you need to carve out exemptions from you shall not discriminate in order to allow those spaces to exist. And I think what's interesting is back in 2010, the discussion was not around women's safe spaces, it was about men's clubs. And should women have access to men's golfing clubs and things like that? And how the circles have turned around. So there is a whole history about women's single-sex spaces as well, which is very rarely what people assume it is. So that was then carved out. And then the assumption is that trans people should be accommodated within the single-sex service which corresponds to how they are, how they present. But you can exclude trans people. And the legal term is if it's a proportionate means to a legitimate aim. So you cannot just exclude trans people because they're trans, because that's not proportionate and it's not legitimate. So, and that's been the whole basis of the law. That is how it's currently being seen. What we've got at the moment is an Equality and Human Rights Commission, which has, we think, been very compromised. The chair of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission has said that she wants, she's quite happy to follow the government's agenda, which is not looking at protected characteristics, but looking at protecting the rights of poor white kids, working class kids from the north, for example. And whilst there are issues around economic deprivation and so on, they are different issues to what, say, black kids would face or what girls face in terms of endemic discrimination. So, but the law is the law. The law remains the same. Trans people should be included in the spaces which correspond to their sexual presentation, their gender, unless you have an extremely good reason not to do so. And the courts up till now have set that bar very, very high. Now, where this becomes relevant is when the campaigns started to oppose the reform of the Gender Recognition Act, they were all conflating it with the Equality Act. Oh, no, you can't have that because then men will simply declare themselves to be women and all hell will break loose. Well, actually, under the Equality Act, that all works under the basis of self-declaration anyway, and that's been the law for 10 years and all hell hasn't broken loose. And it's only relatively recently where the anti-GRA reform campaigners have accepted that actually that argument is, the argument they were using was flawed, because actually it's the Equality Act that drives this. So now they're pivoting to try and attack the Equality Act specifically to cut trans people back out again. So, and actually that's the nasty bit underneath of these campaigns, is that when they think they've won against trans people, you start to see them attacking other LGBT rights, such as the right to adoption or inclusive education or even same-sex marriage. They're really going for that. And that's sort of evidence of the underlying political agenda underneath this campaign.
And I think same-sex marriage, it's always good to remind ourselves that it was Lib Dem Minister Lynn Featherstone who saw that through. And it's one of, when people talk about the coalition government, the 2010 to 15 coalition government, I think there were plenty of decisions taken that were more difficult for us as Liberal Democrats to stand on doorsteps and talk about. That is one I'm very proud that Lib Dems were in government to deliver. One of the things I wanted to talk about is the number of trans people in the world. And I think particularly what gives me hope is the way kids approach these issues. And if I think back to when I was at school, so I'm 42, so it's been quite some time since I've been in school, but I don't remember there being lots of trans kids in my school. Talking to a friend of mine who is a teacher at a secondary school, there are trans kids in her school. And the kids just kind of go, oh yeah, fine, and bounce on with it because it's their mate and they're living their lives as who they are. And that gives me hope for the future, that the kids will shrug and it'll be, you know, their mate's their mate and yeah, and what we're doing at break kind of thing. And that gives me hope. Has there been a change in the number of people who are trans, or has there been a change in the number of people who are living as themselves, so coming out as trans, or how has that changed? Is people's perception moving along with the reality?
Again, statistics are very sparse in this. We might get an idea in a month or two when the 2021 census results, initial results are out. We've worked on the basis generally from previous studies across the world, which seem to consistently indicate that about 1% of the population has some problems identifying with the sex they were assigned at birth. Now, that doesn't necessarily, so you can use that as a sort of an umbrella, you know, that's everybody, the maximum level of the population who are trans. The number of people who are likely to take some steps to address that is probably 1 in 10. So you're looking at 0.1% roughly of the population. We'll start to do something about it. What you've had recently is a big focus on non-binary people, particularly with young people. I'm not non-binary. You'll need to talk to somebody who is non-binary to try and get a proper understanding of that. But I, you know, being liberal, that's what they say they are. That's what they are. Who am I to question that? So we know that as trans people have become more visible across the internet and in the media, that it encourages the wrong word. It makes people safe to feel as though they can actually do something about it. It opens people's eyes as to, oh, I can, you know, maybe there is a way out of this. And so we know that the number of people being referred to the NHS clinics, both adults and children, has grown a lot over the past 10 years or so. But then that's not necessarily a problem either. If you have a look at, you know, what happened in the 1920s to 1940s, when people realized that actually forcing people not to be left-handed was not a good idea, you saw a big rise in the number of people who were left-handed until it plateaued at the percentage who were left-handed in the population. And I suspect you will see the same sort of thing with trans people. What we do know is that the NHS is really struggling to deal with the number of people who are coming forward, has done for quite some time, and that problem is only getting worse. So we're trying to persuade the NHS to look at other methods of working with trans people to give them the treatment that they need. So I don't know if I suspect the number isn't increasing. It's just the number who feel that they can do something about it is increasing. But as I say, statistics in this area are quite hard to come by.
So that's useful. And I'd seen the left-handed comparison, and I'm glad you raised it, because I think that's one that everybody can understand fairly easily. We've talked a little bit about America and different states in America taking different approaches. I think particularly when it comes to trans kids and what, whether people need to wear skirts or trousers in school, down to that kind of level of invasion of people's liberty. But I wonder if there are good examples in the world of countries for whom they've kind of nailed it on trans issues. They're not struggling like some countries are to get their heads around some of these issues. And are there examples of good practice that we can steal their best ideas? And when there is a Liberal Democrat majority government at some point in the future, can implement their best policies?
In terms of medical treatment, yes, there are areas of good practice. It's evolving. I think what trans people have always had is a feeling that you need to jump through other people's hoops in order to prove that you're trans enough. And that's actually quite nasty in a way. But you've got places like the Netherlands, which were pioneering about 30 years ago, the use of puberty blockers for treating trans children. And similar practice now in parts of the USA and Canada as well. So there are those areas which are looking at doing right. I think what we need to understand is that the UK now has a reputation for being incredibly transphobic in its media output. And I'll refine that slightly, because when we talk about the media, what we tend to talk about is news and current affairs. And we will talk about news and current affairs as media because we're politicians, we're campaigners, that's what we're interested in. If you look at the wider media landscape, you look at things like drama or music, young people's television, they get it. It's the news and current affairs, which is where the problem is. So, and I think the other thing I'd say is in terms of trans children, which is some of where the concern comes from, is that trans people don't suddenly emerge on their 18th birthday with this idea that actually, hey, I'm trans. There was a study quite a few years back which showed that the age where people realized that they were different, although not necessarily having the language to describe it, tended to be between 7 and 8 years old. So trans adults were generally trans children. And it's just a question of having the confidence to do something about it. I didn't do anything about it until I was 40. So, and I look at the young people, admire the confidence enormously. And I think I probably must have done that when I was very young, but have obliterated most of those memories. So I think you need to understand that most trans adults were trans children. And the other phrase I tend to use is that most of the time people try to not be trans, and it's only when they break that they kind of give in and accept that they are trans. So conversion practice, almost all of us have grown up in heteronormative families. Almost all trans people do not have other trans people in our families. So that it kind of implies that sexuality and identity are very, very resilient within yourself. And people try and fit in and do what's expected of them until such point as they can't do it anymore. And that's where the health system comes in, because you tend to be at the point, we shouldn't be at this. We shouldn't rely on this happening for treatment. But trans people who are coming forward to treatment tend to be at a point when they're breaking because they can't cope anymore. And that's a really rubbish way of diagnosing stuff. And surely it's better to be accepting that trans people exist and allow them to come forward before things break and become horrific in their lives. That's what motivates me to do the campaigning in this particular area.
Real. I'm really keen that we leave people with some resources, because there might be people with lots more questions than we've had time to answer today. And I think Helen has given lots of her time and has really kindly answered some of the questions I had, not least about left-handedness. But we can all go and educate ourselves, because as Liberal Democrats, we're geeks and nerds, and we like going away and finding lots of information. And I think if you put some of these issues into your favourite search engine, you can end up down all sorts of rabbit holes that are less helpful than you might hope for them to be. So I thought the last contribution I'll make probably in this discussion is 3 sites that I think are really good and helpful and informative. So the LGBT plus Liberal Democrats, who have been up and at 'em campaigning on these issues since the dawn of time itself. And I've got some really good resources out there specifically for Liberal Democrat campaigners to help you with your campaigning. Transactual is a really good factual resource that's on there. So answer some questions, direct you to scientific studies, do some really good factual based work. And Stonewall have been resolute on some of these issues for some time now, and have been shouted at shrilly in a number of different ways for a while, and they're another useful resource. So if people have questions we've not been able to answer, hopefully they will find those resources useful.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I think the only thing I'd add to that list of resources is that last year I actually listened to an audiobook called Detransition Baby, which was written by a trans woman called Tori Peters. And I have to say it was great, actually. It was a sort of, this is an issue where I've obviously come across it from a sort of political perspective and from a policy perspective. But I sometimes find that, you know, it can feel a bit dry and abstract, and sort of literature and fiction around the issue can just kind of help you think about it in sort of different ways. And I don't know, that was something that sort of I felt gave me a slightly different perspective. So if anyone's listening and has any other sort of literary or, you know, TV or anything like that recommendations, I'd love to hear them. Thank you very much for joining.
Sorry to interrupt, Laura, is if you're listening to a conversation about trans issues where none of the people involved in the conversation are trans, that's the other, I think, reasonable temperature check on whether it's a good and healthy discussion that's going to shed more light than heat.
Definitely. So yeah, I mean, I think thank you for joining us, Lisa and Helen. Helen, do you want to sort of finish off the episode and leave us with any parting thoughts?
Oh, I did it just now.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining. Thank you both for joining. Thank you, listeners, for listening. And I hope to join us again soon.